Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of JavaScript. Today we're going to discuss arrays, sets of maps, and also objects in JavaScript as well. So basically we're covering the concepts that we would call data structures right here. And a data structure is basically just a type of collection that can hold other entities. So an array is the most fundamental, so we'll focus on that, but also make mention of sets and maps as well. So to create an array, we can use syntax like this. So if I say, for example, const array name equals, and then you could say new array, and then give it a length, which is actually optional. You can use the array of method, or you can use an array literal. Just like I can have an empty string, which we've talked about before, where you have like two double quotes, like that, to do a string, we can do an open and closing square brackets in order to delimit the beginning and starting of an array. So we can use the new keyword with the array list constructor. If we create an array and assign values at the same time, we could put new array and then the array list. We could say array of and the array list, or we can put brackets around that. So we'll see a specific example like this. So if I say const rates, for example, equals new array, and then you'll see there's 4 values here. So this creates an array that holds or contains all 4 of these values. Same thing here with array of right here. We can contain these 6 values here. And then using literals, this would be an array of strings in this case. So there's 3 strings, Grace, Charles, Ada. The syntax for referring to an element in an array, so the question is, once I have all these multiple items in an array, how do I actually access the individual items to get them back or to change their value? And the answer is to use something called an index. You just apply the array name and then grab that value at that index. So here's code that refers to the elements in an array. Now, you might think this is a typo because it says third element and it's showing a 2, and it says second element and it's showing a 1. But that's actually how it works. The index of 0 refers to the first element in the array. An index of 1 refers to the second element, then an index of 2 is the third, and so on. So if I open up Chrome here real quick, because this is a kind of a quick and dirty way to demonstrate some JavaScript. I guess I could zoom out a little bit on that. So I could say const my array, and then give it some elements. Okay, and if I say my array, you'll see that it actually, the Google's DevTools, which I brought up, this is from Google, so that has nothing to do with what we're doing here. You can ignore that. But Google DevTools can be brought up with the F12 key. So I can hit F12 like that, and it will generally show you what's going on the web page that you're on. So actually, let's, my array still seems to be existing since we haven't closed the browser. And if I extend this, it'll tell me the size is 5, the length is 5. And it shows me the elements at each of the indices, okay? So at index 0, we have a 1, index 1, and we have a 2, etc. So if I want to grab my array at 3, that returns a 4 because in this particular array, it's the 0, 1, 2, 3, third element, so it has the element 4. If I want to change this, I could make a names array. I could put John, Bob, and Sally right there. And then if I want to say names at 0, that will return John. So you can access each of the elements as if it were its own full-fledged variable that you created with const or let by itself. So accessing values to an array by accessing each element. In this case, they're showing you how you can change or give the initial values. So for example, they created an array of size 4, but if we do that just off the bat, if I say const sum array equals new array, and then give it size 4, and then say sum array, you'll see that it says it's empty. So it has really no elements. If I try to access an element, it'll tell me it's undefined. Okay, so it says, hey, there's nothing defined there. But if I want to, I could say array at 0 equals John. I can say sum array at 1 equals Sam. Sum array at 2 equals Jack. Now, if I do something like console.log, or just repeat it in here, and say sum array at, say, 1, you'll see that it shows us the value Sam. Now, you might see this little undefined that keeps popping up randomly when we do different things. Don't worry about that. That's basically what the method that we called returned, since console.log doesn't return a value, meaning if you call it, it doesn't replace itself with another value after it does its work, it will return undefined. It could be a value returning function, in which case it would, of course, return a value. Here we go. So you can also get the property length of the array, and it'll tell you how many elements or how many cells it has. Also, delete can be used to remove elements. Now this one's going to bother some people who are coming from Java or C++ or C# or pretty much any other language. This is very, very strange with JavaScript. So if I create an array, and this is going to be at index 0, index 1, and index 2. Now if I want to add an element to index 3, which doesn't exist already, I can actually do this. Now this would crash in pretty much every other language. If I said numbers at numbers.length in Java, it would crash. It would not allow me to do that. It would go outside the bounds of the array. But this actually works in JavaScript. This is one of the ways to add an element to the array. In fact, you can go way beyond numbers.length, and it will actually add elements past that. So if you see right here, if I say sum array at sum array.length equals, let's say, Nathan, and then I want to print out sum array again, you will notice that in this case, it actually kind of skips over that index. It's really there, but it's undefined, the index 3. So it will actually go beyond what's not defined yet. And even if I do this, if I say sum array at 10 equals Samantha, like that, then I can do console.log sum array. And you notice that it's telling you there's empties in here. Now, Google does this, Google Chrome specifically does this kind of handy thing where it tells you where the empties are. It says, hey, there's an empty here, meaning it's undefined, and then there's 5 undefines right here. You can loop through even. So if I said for let I equal 0, I less than summary.length, and do I++. Now the length has changed, of course. I'm going to do console.log sum array at I. And let's see what this does for us. And you'll see John, Sam, Jack, undefined, Nathan, undefined with 5 of those, Samantha, undefined. Okay, pretty cool. So now, if we go back here, you can see also that we can remove elements by calling delete on them. This will also be used with objects. But if I say delete numbers at 1, it will actually restore it back to undefined. Pretty cool. Removing all the elements, you could just set the length to 0, and that will actually remove all the elements of the array. The length is not read-only. You can actually set it in JavaScript. Let's see here. So I already showed you how to go through a loop with an array. this is another syntax that you can use. You can use a for in loop with an array. The statements that use the index to access the array, you could say let index in array name. So that's just kind of a shortcut. So if I do this, if I clear this real quick and I say for index in some array, and then I console.log some array at index, it will actually print all the names, but notice it skips over all the undefines. So that's one of the things that this special syntax for this type of for loop does differently than a regular for loop. It'll only go to the valid indices that aren't undefined. And further, if we keep on going here, we have another type of for loop called the for of loop. In this case, it's a little different than the for in loop. The for in loop is still based on the index, but it skips over those cells that don't contain valid values, in other words, undefined values. If you use the for of loop will grab the values that are in the array, and you don't have to even talk about or use the index. Okay, so what that means is, in this case, I would not, and earlier with the in version, and even the version I used, the long version, let I equal 0, etc., I used an index. However, for the of version, the let, we'll just say name of some array. Now in this case, name is not going to be an index. It's actually going to represent each name that's in there. So I don't even access an index. And this one will not skip over the undefines in this case. So you can see that's pretty cool, right? So it goes to all the different elements. It does tell you where undefines exist, etc. So there's kind of three distinct popular for loop syntaxes that exist in JavaScript. You've got the regular for loop, where you have for let I equal 0, I less than size, etc. That's more traditional, like most languages have. And then some languages have kind of this version, the for of loop, where you can go to each element without even referring to the index. And then there's the for in loop, which still uses an index, but gives you more syntax conciseness by allowing you not to have to declare and assign the variable, do a test, and then increment the index by 1. It'll just do that by default. The basic version of the for loop is actually the most flexible. You can actually tell it to do things like don't increment I by 1, increment it by 3, or do more than one test, etc. But since this is so common to go increment by 1 and do things like that, if you have a collection, then the for in and for of loops are perfect. The regular for loop you don't have to use with a collection, but you can. So there's all kinds of things you can use the regular for loop for. The syntax for destroying an array or destructing an array, you have const or let, and then the identifier is equal to the array name. So two arrays used by following examples. If I have totals equal to that, full name equal to that, and then assign the first three elements like that. So what this would do is if I say const total1, total2, total3, I said destructing, I meant destructuring. So this is special syntax for destructuring. So what this means is these variables, it's kind of backwards. You're not really creating an array, although you're kind of using array syntax here. You're saying that the single variable total1 should be set to the first element in totals. That is the element at 0. And then total2, element at 1, total3, element at 2. All right. And if you do any skipping, you can just use a comma with nothing in between, and it will work. Perfect. Destructure a string, you can do that if you need to. A string basically behaves like an array of characters or individual character strings that are size 1. So right here you have first, second, third equals, and then USA. That means that first we'll get the single character string U, second we'll get the character S, third we'll get the character A. Cool. Terms related to arrays, these are things that you should look at in the book or elsewhere if you don't have the book, and make sure you're comfortable with these terms. So a sparse array we covered earlier, we didn't really cover earlier, so you don't really need to know that. But it just basically is referring to an array with very few elements and a whole lot of undefines, typically in between elements. All right, methods of the array type that add, modify, remove, and copy elements. One other way of adding and removing elements are using these methods right here. Push and pop. For those of you familiar with data structures, you know that that refers to or is related to the stack abstract data type. And then we have shift and unshift and splices. So we'll talk about, and slicing actually, which is different from splicing. We'll talk about that in just a minute. So if I have a names array that's by the following, used by the following example, should be used, sorry. Don't know why that is in there like that. So it's chapter 15, slide 21. Okay, make a note of that so I can tell Marak about it. You can do this. You can add elements to and remove elements from the end of the array. So when you push elements at the end of the array, you'll notice that when you push Alan, Linus, it will push Alan first and then Linus. Okay, so this goes in a last in, first out type scenario here, because pop will actually grab the most recently added name. So names.pop will remove that last thing that you just added. So the last in was Linus. That was the last string that was added to this array, and it's the first to come out if you use the corresponding pop method. So that behaves like a stack, okay? A stack is a data structure that does last in, first out behavior. But you can also add and remove elements from the beginning of the array, and you can use these combined as well. But if we look here, unshift actually adds an element to the beginning. So basically unshift is like make room for me, I'm coming in. And then shift basically means let's remove that first element, and then you can shift everything over back to index 0, 1, 2, 3, because 0 is no longer occupied by Linus. So that's where the shift term comes from. Now this also kind of behaves like a stack, just at the other end, and it doesn't use traditional method terms. Some other methods you might want to use on an array would be the splice method, which allows you to replace elements at specific indices. So if I say splice 1, 2, it will put Mary and Linus, in this case, inside the array at those indices. Index 1 now has Mary, index 2 now has Linus. If you want to copy some elements of the array to a new array, you can say names.slice 1, now notice this is slice, not splice, slice 1, 3, so that gives me the element at 1 and the element at 2, not including 3. So it includes the first index and then goes up to the one just below the second index that you specify. So if I put, let's say we had more elements in the array and I had put 7 here, it would go up to 6. It would go from 1 to 6. But since it says 1, 3, it goes from 1 to 2. We say that's 1 inclusive, 3 exclusive. The actual original array names is not changed. It just gives a copy. If I want to copy all the elements of the array into a new array, I can just say names.slice and give it no arguments, and that will actually copy the full array. Other methods that are very, very useful to inspect an array are index of, and then you give it a value to look for, and it will tell you what index that exists at if it exists in the array. So what happens if it doesn't exist in the array? Well, it would return a -1. Last index of looks for the last occurrence. Includes does some similar stuff, include and find index. Filter and some of these other ones actually perform what's called functional coding or functional programming. Allows you to do something for every element in the array or for some elements in the array, or to apply a filter. There's all kinds of cool stuff. Entries does also. So these are a little more advanced, but just be aware of them. They provide ways to quickly, without writing your own for loop, for example, and going through the elements in an array and doing something to them, you can actually just tell it to, hey, for every one of those things that you find that does this, do that. And then there's some other stuff that you can do as well. So here's number arrays in the following example. This one uses 1 through 20. 2 ways to check for a specific value. So you could say if numbers.index of 5 is not -1. In other words, if we do find a 5, do this. If numbers includes 5, meaning if we find a 5, do this. So that's 2 different ways to see if the array contains the element. Filtering. This is using some very shortcut syntax. This actually uses a lambda expression. So const less than 10 equals numbers.filter value such that the value is less than 10. So what this does is it's actually going to take the original array called numbers and apply a filter to it. So the filter, as you probably know, removes certain particles and lets other particles through, or things. In this case, it's going to be values. So what does this filter do to our original array? Now, it doesn't actually modify the original array, but what will the result array contain? And it will filter it such that each value, so this is the iterated value name, meaning it goes through each element and just says, okay, well, hey, index at 0, hey, you're a 1, well, you're the value for this iteration. Are you less than 10? Okay, we include you. Then it'll say, okay, 2, you're the value. Is 2 less than 10? Okay, we include you. And so on until it gets up to 10. When it gets to 10, what happens is it says, hey, value, well, I guess you're 10 now. Is 10 less than 10? Well, it's not less than 10, so no, you don't get included. And then it does that for the rest of the elements here. So that's a very, very quick way to do some filtering. And these can be arbitrarily complex. You could have a function call here. You could have anything here that performs the filtering. Very, very impressive. Now, checking if all the numbers in the array are positive. So in this case, this returns a true. This is the it's basically a quantifier that determines if all values in the array are greater than 0, making sure there are no non-positive, meaning negative or 0, values in the array. If you're counting 0 as positive, you'd have to put greater than or equal to, of course. But this returns true or false. Okay, so it returns a Boolean. So this is the second part here, using a for of loop with the entries method. So you can say let key value in these brackets of numbers.entries. So if each of those entries, go through each of the entries, and if each of those entries is complex, like they have different components, you can actually set it so that the key, notice that's a tick mark, so it's using template literals instead of regular quotations. So that means we can interpolate this string here, and this key will actually be printed out as 0, and it will say, okay, value is 1 for that. Key 1, value is 2, etc. Methods of the array type that transform elements. So the other ones just returned information about the array. These actually change the array, the original array itself. The other one might return information or return a completely different array with certain qualities. This one will actually modify the original array. So we've got for each join, toString sort, reverse, map, reduce, flat, and flat map. Map, reduce, and for each are used quite extensively. Depending on what you do, you might even use some of the other ones. But even like sort is also common. But map, reduce is actually the name of an algorithm used in data science a lot. For each is the name of a repetition control structure in a lot of different programming languages, and this allows you to apply functional programming just like some of the others, that you say, okay, for every element in this array, I want you to do this. So here's an example. Convert the elements in an array to a single string. So if you say, let str equals names.join, that will, in this case, it will return a string that contains all of these elements separated by commas by default as a single string. Now, if you say names.join and you specify an argument to the join method, in this case, notice there's a comma and a space, then it will put a comma and a space here. If you put, an @ symbol or a $sign, then there would be an @ symbol or a $sign there. You specify how to join these values together. You can say names.toString. That will do essentially what the original join does in this case, because it takes the whole array and tries to convert it to a single string. If I want to sort numeric values in ascending sequence, meaning going up, this was kind of a little clever way they did it. The sort function expects a Boolean type value, so you tell it how to sort them, and it says sort actually takes 2 values, which is interesting. So it's at any given spot, it's comparing 2 values as it goes. For any 2 values, you're saying x minus y. So that means if there's a negative value, you put it before, and a positive value, you put it after. So in this case, this will actually sort the numbers. Now, there could be more readable ways to write this. It just needs to tell the sort function how do I compare these 2 elements. So if you think of a better way to do this, that's fine. It's just showing you kind of a quick and dirty way to do it. For the map function or map method, what this one does is it returns a new array in this case that I think I had said that it modifies the original array. It does not, but it does provide you with a new modified array version of the original in this case. Numbers.map, in this case, it takes all values, each value, and it returns value of 2. So if your original numbers had 2, 5, 6, 8, etc., then this will actually have 4, 10, 12, 16, etc. And then the original array is unchanged. We can transform the elements and then convert to a single string if we want to by using reduce. So this is a little bit more complicated. It takes the values and they're basically just saying I want to take all of the values here, bring them to lower, and you have previous and current. So the current is these values right here. It basically takes the previous or the current in each of these and places it after the previous. So at the very beginning you have names and then nothing else, and then grace gets placed after a space, and then it passes that whole thing in with names and grace back to the reducer on Charles, and then Charles gets placed in, and it takes this whole thing again and passes it back to the reduce and keeps going until it's done with each name. And then at the very end you have all these names right here. Flatten an array that's nested 2 levels deep. This one basically just kind of removes the levels on here. So if I have an array, it has these simple elements here, and then it gets to a subarray with a subarray. It basically takes those and it flattens them. So nesting them or flattening them up to 2 levels deep. Then they go through one of their examples. We're not going to spend time on that one. Let's see what else we have here. Splitting strings. Splits on strings is actually very useful. You can actually tell it to take a name like Grace M. Hopper, and if you say split on a space, it will actually create an array, and each element will be an individual string, Grace, and then the string M, and then the string Hopper. So that's pretty cool. We can go past some of the date stuff, but you can refer to it if you get a date assignment or need it for your own work. Let me see here. What else do we need? That's associative arrays. You can create what are called maps or associative arrays. In this case, I would say dictionaries or associative arrays. I said maps, but I meant dictionaries. So basically, this is kind of like the word you're looking up in the dictionary, and then whatever here is its value or its definition. So in this case, line cost, if I ever look up line cost, and you're basically kind of using that as an index, except it doesn't have to be an integer. You can use a string. That's very common usage of this. So that would be what we call an associative array or a dictionary. All right, I'm going to keep going on there. You might need to work with a format of data called JSON or JavaScript object notation at some point, and just be aware. This will be something when we do a little bit on AJAX and how to get data from a website. A lot of times websites will provide data such that you can download them or interact with them, and it sends you a string in this format called JSON, JavaScript object notation. And the methods of this JSON type, static methods, so you call them directly off the name JSON, are stringify, which returns a JSON string for specified object or array, so it automatically turns it into JSON for you. Or if you get JSON from a website or some other source, database, wherever, you can say .parse, and it will return the object or array that contains the data in the specified JSON string. This is extremely handy and crucial if you're going to be working with any kind of back end, which is very frequently the case in larger companies. You're going to be dealing with that kind of data. So in this case, they created an array of arrays that stores two tasks. So tasks is an array, and you notice that when it pushes it, it's pushing another array that just has two values. It has finish current project and then a date. So they're kind of treating this like a tuple value, which has like two different pieces of data in it, even though it is an array. And then they're pushing another one, get specs for the next project, and then a date there, and then they're stringifying it. You can set it in local web storage or send it over the internet. You can send it to a database for later retrieval. You can do all kinds of stuff with it. In this case, they saved it to regular web storage. And then later on, you can retrieve that data back. So the JSON might look like this. And you won't even have to worry about the format really most of the time. To get the data back, you just say json.parse. And then you parse that JSON data that you grabbed from local storage. This is actually really, really helpful. The task list application actually does this kind of calculating. Also be aware, again, I think I've mentioned it before a couple times, but anytime you see a $sign in the Maroc book, just realize that they just be careful and be aware that it's kind of them using the same thing or a shortcut with jQuery. So don't use jQuery. You can use the regular vanilla JavaScript. But anytime they use this, this is basically the same as query selector. So if I passed query selector, document.querySelector, and I put task list, this would return the same value. You just have to use different methods on it, which are all in the book. Okay, you can create sets. These are less popular than arrays, but they are useful sometimes. Sets are like arrays. You can actually initialize them to an array. They do not allow duplicates. Different things you can access. You can do many of the same things you do an array. You can access the size instead of length. You get size. You can add elements, delete elements, clear, determine if it has a value, apply for each, return the entries, return just the values and just the keys. So all kinds of stuff. And a map is another data structure that you might end up using. And it looks like this, new map. and you pass in an array of arrays or something like that, or you can make it empty, and you can decide how to create that map. So in this case, they're explicitly creating these maps right here. So this right here, we have Grace, comma, Hopper, and Ada, comma, Lovelace. So map, some of the methods of the math type, setting and getting. Okay, so this is kind of also acting similarly to a dictionary as well, because you can set keys values as well, and do many of the same things that you tested before. So you can actually see if the map has a particular key before you try to get the value at that particular key. Okay, so if you say this and it says false, it'll skip over this if statement. But if it's true and it has the key Grace, then you can say, okay, get me that value then. And this gets the corresponding value. You'll see that the way they did that earlier is they had this is key, this is value. And they just use syntax you would have for regular arrays or 2D arrays. Good. Very quickly, we're just going to go over objects, just so you're familiar with them. You can definitely practice on W3 Schools or Free Code Camp. And of course, assignments, the different little exercises they have in the book and the assignments that I assign. How to initialize a new object with an object literal. Just like arrays can be initialized as empty arrays with the square brackets, objects can be initialized empty with the curly braces. An object, if you've taken another programming class, you don't need to. It's not a prerequisite for this course, but I'm just trying to fill in some context for those that have. If you've taken another programming class, you're probably familiar with objects and object-oriented programming. An object's just an entity with subparts and frequently behaviors as well. Things it can do and things that it knows. So data would be things that it knows. And you notice they're using colon here, not an equal sign, and we're using comma instead of a semicolon, because these are different components of this invoice object. And in this case, this is not a class. So if you're used to using classes and working with that type of syntax, this is a little bit different in JavaScript. JavaScript is a prototypical language, so it doesn't really have what we call classes per se. They have added new syntax later, so you can use syntax that looks like you're using classes, but you're not really. Under the hood, it's doing stuff like this. So in this case, you're taking the invoice and creating an object. So this curly brace and that curly brace means this is an object. And then right here, I have one piece of data called tax rate. And then another thing right here is the function subtotal, which, since it's inside of an object, is called a method. So a function inside of an object is called a method. This takes a parameter called subtotal, and you can always refer to the pieces of data or methods, other methods of the object, by saying this dot, and then whatever data you're accessing. In this case, tax rate. In this case, when they call get total, it will take subtotal. It will set a local variable, sales tax, equal to the subtotal times this dot tax rate, so it knows you're talking about this right here. And then it returns the subtotal plus the sales tax. Pretty cool. In this case, this is an object with an object inside of it. So this object is called invoice. It has an object component or field or property called terms. And terms itself has due dates and description. So it has no behaviors, just two pieces of data. Now, how do I access, say, due dates? Well, you would say invoice, which grabs the original object, dot terms, which grabs that inner object, the nested object, and then dot due dates right here, or dot description. Awesome. So terms related to object literals are, of course, object literal, property, method, and nested object. So make sure you know these terms. This is an object literal. because you're creating individually a single object. You're not making a cookie cutter to make a bunch of different objects like a class in, say, Java or C++ or C#. You can do that by working with prototypes or new syntax, which I'm sure we'll see. But notice that you can also use two different ways to code a method. You've got the properties, which are data. Method is the behavior. The traditional or early on syntax that we've used for years would look like this. You name it get total, and then say, okay, well, that's a function that takes these two things and does this. Newer syntax would look like this. You don't use the function keyword. You just go straight for it, name your method, give it a body. These curly braces mean the body of the method, not an object. And then you return subtotal plus subtotal times tax rate, for example. Two ways to initialize a property to a variable or constant. So you've got let name equals grace, let year equals 2021. Traditional syntax looks like this. You would say person, then name must equal name, year must equal year. And the shorthand properties, you just put name comma year if there's no alternative name. So that means that you can say let name equals year, and then since this says name equals grace rather and year equals 2021, it will know that you're talking about this variable right here. Excuse me. Pardon. This variable right here is called name, so it knows you're referring to it over here. You don't actually have to uncover name shadowing or anything like that. It lets you do it automatically like this. But you can also do this because it knows, okay, well, you want a property and you also want it to have that same value. So you can do that. You can remove properties from an object using delete, and you can add properties or change their values on the fly. Now, this is another thing that would bother people coming from another language. So if you've never had another programming language, don't think you're necessarily at a deficit because this is newer. If you had another programming language, a lot of this stuff would throw you off really, really badly because you cannot do this in other programming languages. If I want to add a property after I've already created the object, I want to add a property to that object. For example, this one's empty to start with. I can just add it. You just say invoice.taxRate equals this, and even though tax rate never existed in the original object, you can add it. So you can like stick it at runtime. You stick it to the object as you need it. Same thing with methods. I can add a method by saying the name of the class and then dot, and then just write out the method definition. It's as easy as that. This is very strange for a lot of people coming from other languages because they're not used to being able to, after the quote class is defined and the object is created, you can't add properties or methods or anything like that, and you can't remove properties or methods. So that's very, very strange for a lot of people coming from other languages. Two constants that refer to the same object. You have to be aware that when I say something like const today equals new date, that it creates a brand new object in memory, but what today actually holds inside of it as a variable isn't actually a date object. It's a reference or the memory address of where the date object lives. So if I say const now equals today, that's actually not copying the whole object. It's going to copy the date. Okay, so today, if I say today equals new date and you don't specify any parameters, for the date class, that just sets it to the current date. Okay, so on my machine it says 10/5/2021. And then if you say now equals that, they both point to the same object. So they both are pointing to the date with 2021. But if later on I say today.set full year to 1968 and then print out now full year instead of today's, they'll both print out 1968 because they're referring to the same object. Okay, so remember there is a difference between the object itself and the address of the object. And what's actually being held here is the address. This is an object with an accessor property. These are newer features, features that allow you to use accessors. So full name, so you could say full name. If you put get in front of it, it will return whatever you tell it to. And if you put set and it takes a value, you tell it how to set the value. And then you can just use it as if it was a piece of data, like this. That'll call the getter. This will call the setter. Okay? So it'll do that directly. Terms related to methods and properties, concise method syntax, shorthand property notation, the delete operator, getters and setters, etc. So definitely look into those. Make sure that you're comfortable with those. They do start going into JavaScript libraries. We're not using jQuery, so don't worry about that. You can check it out if you want to, but a lot of what jQuery used to provide has actually been integrated into core JavaScript with the newer versions. So I typically don't find jQuery all that impressive, but there are a lot of libraries that are still in use and that are still very popular. Libraries and frameworks. So you've got React and Angular and Vue, V-U-E. A lot of these different, there's actually one called Polymer, which isn't really used that much anymore, and then another one called Lit Element, which was grown out of Polymer. But we've got all these different versions or different things that make using JavaScript in certain contexts easier, or you can write more verbose code with less work once you know how to do it. Okay, so you can create your own libraries if you want. They let you group similar functionality in a single file. They can make your code easier to understand, maintain, and reuse. And they encourage what's called separation of concerns, which in software engineering means that different parts are concerned with different things, and you may not want every part of your program to be heavily integrated with every other part. All right, so you can include and use your own Java libraries once you create them. So not very difficult here. If I just make a library in a JS and I just literally just create this object here, this object is now accessible as soon as I say, hey, include this script here. And in this case, again, they're using jQuery. We wouldn't be. Okay, miles per gallon applications, again, one of their little examples. Now, here's where we start getting into classes. In reality, for those that care, the nuance here, if you don't care, don't worry about it, but the nuance here is that JavaScript actually doesn't have actual classes. This is actually what we would call syntactic sugar. It's to make it look more similar to languages like Java or C++ or C#, so we don't have to deal with prototypes, which has been kind of a bane of existence for people dealing with JavaScript for the longest time. So it creates the prototypes behind the scenes as needed, and we can create our own little cookie cutter using this new syntax, this class syntax. So if I create a class called invoice, this will allow me to define objects, multiple copies of the objects, and I can extend those as well, but this will allow me to make many of them. So right here, if you're coming from Java, the constructor normally is the same name as the class. But in JavaScript, the name of the constructor is constructor. What this does is whenever you create an instance of invoice, it will set the subtotal and the tax rate to null. Then it has a method called getTotal, and it takes all these values and then returns a value. So this one's fairly simple. You'll notice that I didn't declare any variables anywhere else. You can do it directly in the constructor. I can just say this.subtotal equals null, this.tax rate equals null, and all of a sudden I have two fields called subtotal and tax rate. So I didn't do them anywhere else. They're properties, also another term for them, properties, subtotal, and tax rate. And then later, I can actually create instances. I could say const invoice equals new invoice, capital I, and then I could set the subtotal, tax rate, and then call getTotal. This would be a code that attempts to create an invoice object and forgets to use the new keyword. You'll actually get an exception, meaning your code will crash. Okay? Good. Pretty straightforward here. You can also allow the user to pass in values for subtotal and tax rate. They can still choose not to. If they don't pass them in, then these will both be not defined. So it will set it to undefined. And I can create an instance of it right here with 100 and 0.875, or 0.0875 rather, and then get the total. The hierarchy in JavaScript allows you to, or has many different parts here. You've got object at the top, and then you actually have these other types that we've talked about before, but they actually inherit from object. They are string, number, Boolean, date, array, and function. So here's another class that they created as an example. They've got the person class, and this one does some similar stuff. I would type this out if I were you inside of, say, Visual Studio Code in a JavaScript file and just play with it, test it out. Mess around with the class and see if you can get data out of it. So for example, just to show you how this might work, let's do a new file, and let's do actually a new folder here we'll call scripts, and I will create a new file called index, if I can stay on my home keys, index.html. And then of course under scripts, I'm going to create a new file and we'll call it object-fun.js. I'm not going to worry about CSS. We'll just do doc type HTML. Language is English. Direction is LTR. Okay. It seems to be angry. Let's look here. Oh, I'm being silly. This belongs in the HTML file. Sorry about that, guys. I'm going to cut it, move it over to the HTML file, and it should be less angry with us. There we go. That's better. So now, we'll do a head tag first, and then we'll do a body tag. And inside the head tag, we'll put meta charset equals UTF-8. And also the title is Fun with Objects. And of course, I'm going to link to the JavaScript file. You can do this at the end of the body, or you can do it in the header. It doesn't really matter. Again, script source equals, and I have to go into the scripts folder, and then go to object-fun.js. And there we go. So now in the body, we'll do something in a little bit. Maybe, let's see here. I'll have a span whose ID is output. And then I'm going to put a break and then put a button whose ID is btn get output, and then click me. And let's go to that code and see what it looks like. So give me just a second. We'll go into the working directory, and right here I'll open that. And right now it's not really that impressive. It just has a click me button up in the corner. You can see, especially if it's 500%, and it doesn't really do anything. Okay, if I hit F12, nothing really going on here. It says there's an unexpected syntax error in the JavaScript file. Maybe I left a less than sign or something. Let's see. Nope, I didn't. Let's hit save and then check again. There we go. Error's gone. So when I cut the value here and pasted it in the HTML, it didn't know that I had saved this, or I hadn't saved it yet, so that's why it didn't know I changed it. So we do need to set this up. So function start, which I usually do, right? This is kind of our starting point. It's kind of like a main function if you're coming from another language. Window.add event listener. For the load event, we're going to call start. And alternatively, again, you could say window.onload equals start, and that does the same thing as above. Okay? But as soon as the window's done loading, we have a button that we want to be associated with some sort of function. So I'm going to have a function handle button, end handle button, And right here, I'm just going to do console.log just to do some tests and just say button works. I usually do this even when I'm working on professional stuff. For clients and things like that, I usually start with something like this just to make sure everything's wired in and looks good, is working correctly. Okay, so right here I'm going to say, actually we can do const, we'll say the button equals, and I'm going to say document dot query selector. I'm going to look for the button with the ID, that's what the pound sign means, and it's got the ID get, or btn get output. btn get output. There you go. Once I grab that, you can say the button dot add event listener, just like we did with window. We're going to set the click event, and then what do I do when I click it? You add the event handler. You tell it that handle button is what I want to happen when I click the button. Good, so let's do a little test just to make sure this works. So we've got all our JavaScript. Make sure that your JavaScript file is spelled correctly and all these words are spelled correctly and that it is linked properly. If I go over here and I hit refresh and then I hit click me, you'll notice that over here in the Google developer tools, which again you can get to very easily by hitting the F12 key on the keyboard like this, and you can also get there if I just hit the three dots up here and then go to more tools and then go to developer tools. And it's also Control-Shift-I as well. But F12 is kind of the time-honored way of opening up to these developer tools. You can also go to elements and look at the different elements here, and that can help you with the HTML as well. Here's console. The cool thing is you can also type JavaScript in here on the fly if I needed to, document.query selector, and I said I wanted to know what the thing with output is, it'll actually show you. And when I hover over it, it'll actually show me in the page span ID as output. So this is absolutely incredibly wonderful tool built into all versions of Chrome. It's included. You don't have to do anything additional to get it. It's with Chrome. So they've really done a good service for people who do development, any kind of design and development. Okay, back to this. So I know it's linked. It's properly wired in, registered. So that means I can actually get to the actual work now. So instead of handle button doing that, maybe I want to work with a class or something. So let's do that. So I'm going to say class test, and then I'll say just functions down here. So I'm kind of separating it. You could actually include it from a separate file. That would work as well. But we're just going to put it in the same file here just to do some basic testing. So I'll say class person, okay, and give it a body here. And then I'm going to create a constructor that takes a name and an age. And in here, I'll say this.name is name, this.age is whatever age they pass in. And then I'm going to make a method called get message, and you're going to just print out, actually let's do this, let's say get message will actually return the message. Let's do that. We'll say we'll say message equals hello there, and then concatenate this.name. How are you? And then maybe I want to do this. I'll say plus equals. I'm actually going to put some HTML in there. So I'll put a break and then put it on another line and just say I hear you are, and then this.age years old. Okay, so that's all the message does. And then we'll return the message. That's all get message does, rather. And that's our class. So we've got a person here. So in handle button, what we're going to do here is I have to access the span. So I'm going to say document.query selector, and I'm going to go for the output span. I'm also going to create a person object, const person, or const, let's say my person equals new person. And this one's going to have name, which is going to be John Baugh. And we'll say that the age is 20. Of course, I'm 20, of course. And then we're going to say the span dot inner HTML equals my person dot get message. Let's see what happens. This should be very, very interesting. So it'll create the object representing a person with John Baugh inside of it. And then it will get the data, the message that I specified here, using get message. Let's see if this works. When I refresh the page, hit click me, and then of course I do get hello there, John Baugh, how are you? I hear you are 20 years old. Right? Pretty cool. So we've encapsulated that data inside of our own object, our own class. And we can create different types of classes, or different types of objects from that class. In fact, you could create different objects and add them to an array. Then you'd have an array of your own custom objects that you could maintain. Every time a person adds a person maybe to a, using text boxes to a list, you could keep track of their data that way. There's all kinds of things you can do with JavaScript, with the objects and arrays. You can use extension or inheritance. This would be something, this is a more advanced topic. You don't really need it, I think, for most of your assignments that you'll have in this particular class. But if you're interested in how do we do inheritance in JavaScript, then this is a perfect example here. We can also test the types by using type of operator here. Returns a Boolean. So very cool. I'll see if there's any other major stuff I want to touch on. Okay, they're just showing you how do I, so I can create a number array, and then you have the array. You can actually use composition here and add different values to it and things like that, because they created a number array class and treated it very much like an array. So they made a push method for it that pushes a number, makes sure it's the right type, etc., and keeps track of it. So it's very, very cool. Treating it very much like an array. Okay. They have a trips application for practice. If you'd like to do that, I would just say don't use. The only thing I'd say is don't use jQuery. Just use regular JavaScript. And all you have to do is look up kind of the alternatives. This is actually just regular JavaScript here. Most of this appears to be regular JavaScript. Instance of says if you pass it an object and if it's an instance of this class, it will return true. So that can help you with same stuff as type of or similar. This is jQuery. So instead of document.ready, you would do the window.add event listener. So it's not really that big of a difference. And instead of something like this, say get the add trip button and set its click event to call this or do this stuff, you would do what I did. You would just say get the button. Instead of using the $, you use query selector on document and then say set the button's click event to call handle button. And that's what it does. That's exactly what they're doing here. They're saying take this button, add trip, and then make it, when you click it, it does this stuff. So that's all they're doing there. All right, dates and times. They're just kind of doing some additional examples. I think most of this is a little more advanced than I would really care for you to get into. So you can probably ignore, at least for class purposes, you can probably ignore everything from slide pretty much everything from slide 60 on, maybe even 55. So just keep that in mind. There's a lot of stuff that's difficult to learn when you first learn JavaScript, and sometimes the Murrock books give you more information than you really need to start with, but they're there for really great reference books. They're way better reference books than books like that you would get from a lot of other publishers and authors. So they make fantastic reference books too. Okay, so what I would say is practice this type of thing. I would say try to copy down my code and test it just to make sure you understand it and can work with it. And maybe make up some examples on your own to try it. Instead of a person class, maybe make a dog class or a pet class. Maybe give it a name and a weight and a breed. So give it 3 properties. Maybe get noises from the animal. So like say get noise as a method and make it go woof or meow or whatever you want it to do. And just do stuff like that. So that's good practice until you get another project that would be relevant. But there's obviously too much to cover with the entire language in a single semester, but this should be a good summary to help you follow along in the book better or to understand better what you read. So hopefully that helps. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. If you have specific questions, oh, that seems to be an update problem. But if you have specific questions, just please don't hesitate to email me. I try to answer them very quickly. If you don't hear from me within a couple days, like send me another follow-up email, because sometimes stuff goes to the junk folder, or sometimes I'll get like 100 emails in a day and think that I responded to one and didn't. So my workflow isn't perfect. So just make sure that you contact me if you have any kind of problems or specific questions or something, and I'll try to guide you in the right direction and where you can practice a little bit better. But I would say definitely W3 Schools and Free Code Camp are really great ideas. And just coming up with your own little tests, and also even maybe take some of the projects in the book and they might display it with JavaScript and jQuery, and you can just kind of remove the jQuery, figure out what they're doing, and then rewrite it with just JavaScript. So that's another good challenge to really practice really well, and you'll have a lot of aha moments that way. All right, thanks. I'll talk to you later.